Welcome, everyone. Please take a seat if you're in here. And welcome to the next session, which is You Put What Where? Vivian and Sam are on stage, and maybe you can start with introducing yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. So hey, everyone. I'm Vivian Neilley. I work at Google, and folks might know me as the one who does kind of ad hoc conformance blogs. So I actually had someone come up to me when I was naming this. You put what where? People know me as the person that does competitive analysis, and they're like, I can't wait for your roast session. So I apologize if you're here for the roast session. That's actually going to be tonight at the happy hour. But we're actually here to talk about AI standardization. So I work at Google, and here's Sam, and he's helping me out from Diameter.
Yes. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Sam Schiffman from Diameter Health. I've been doing software for over 25 years, and about 2.5 years ago, wandered into an amazing company called Diameter Health, and realized there were some really great things happening with FHIR, but also a couple of holes, I think, that we saw as we started talking about it, and I hope we're going to cover some of those today.
Absolutely. So just a little bit about what we're talking about. For perspective, I do a lot of implementation support. So any of the customers using Healthcare API, which is Google's FHIR server, generally I work with them to make sure that they're using it appropriately and have accurate representation of their data. And one of the things that came out of this is once our customers are building a longitudinal record in FHIR, the obvious next step is analytics. And so a lot of what I was seeing and what we'll talk about is there isn't a great way for recommendations for analytics on top of FHIR or even writing it back to FHIR. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we suggest we can be doing about this, especially what we're kind of doing right now. This all started when I had a customer ask me, I built an AI model, what do I do with it? And so I went on Zulip, and it was crickets. You can see here, someone asked, does anyone have any best practices, any support for ML? And there's absolutely none. And so then I kind of dug further. And some people are using devices as an AI model to link the AI model as a device. We also have conflicting might not be the right word, but overlapping resources in this area. So for those who are familiar with measure or evidence, both of them deal in the statistical world, where both of them can be used to kind of represent analytics on top of or from a FHIR resource bundle, et cetera. And so there isn't clear explanations and there aren't clear guidelines on how someone should be representing not only the AI model itself, but any of the outputs on top of the AI, or from the AI model. So then we have on top of that NLP. We, as a community, generally treat natural language processing almost as a separate entity when we're talking about AI and ML. The statistics and some of the more kind of quantitative AI models are separately treated than NLP. And so what this is turning into is we have people writing outputs back into FHIR. And what could happen, and I kind of make this joke that if a patient accesses their FHIR record and grandma realizes that some crappy AI model has a pregnancy prediction, she's not going to understand that. But you can imagine there's a world where we're having models that are making predictions for cancer diagnostics. And perhaps the confidence is extremely low in that diagnostic, but the patient is querying their record and sees, I have a cancer condition, a cancer diagnostic report. And that isn't necessarily obvious to them that it came from an inference and not a clinical record. And so what we're kind of suggesting as part of this happen is we need to come together and build out standardization for how people are not only representing AI, but also the outputs and explainability of it. I'm going to take a little bit of a detour. Explainability and transparency in AI, for those who don't know, is essentially all of the things that need to be wrapped around more than just an output. So we at Google talk about this kind of in 3 ways. We talk about it as it needs to be interpretable. If someone doesn't know what it means, that's not that helpful. It needs to be explainable. So a clinician needs to understand, how did the model come to that conclusion? Did it come to that conclusion that they were at risk of a heart attack because they had gray hair? Because that's not helpful. Perhaps they don't want to trust that model. But the explainability looks different if we have it from a patient perspective. Patients' understanding and explainability is separate than a clinician's, which is separate than a data scientist. And so explainability and usability of an AI model actually looks different for all of the different use cases. So including that along with transparency data is going to be key for us as a community to be able to support not only AI generation and outputs for a data scientist to understand the confidence interval, but also a clinician who needs to understand the most heavily weighted variable. Or perhaps the patient needs to understand exactly what is making this diabetic suggestion and what can they do about it. Is it their weight? Is it their blood pressure? Things like that.
I love the way that you guys break that down. I like to think about it as representing the data responsibly. We have a real need to make sure that we always represent data responsibly. And this is kind of breaking that down into a really good way to think about it.
Exactly. And so one of the things that we've been doing since taking all this into consideration, at Google we have things called data and model cards, where we basically have done a bunch of user research into what are the things that are needed to be explainable, transparent, actionable, et cetera. All kind of encompassed under responsible AI. And so I've taken a look at these. Actually, for reference, I had a whole profile and implementation guide built out off of the evidence resource. And if anyone is in here on that working group, it is almost entirely different in R4B. And so I showed up to DevDays and tested out my profile, and it was entirely broken. So next week, maybe, hopefully, we'll have a little bit more of some of the implementation work and the implementation guide and profiles that are going to be considered for the standardization. But really what we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about is just why these exist in the first place. Without the standards I've talked about, you have the patient who doesn't understand what they're seeing, doesn't understand where it came from. This also allows us to hold organizations accountable. We know going forward there's going to be plenty of organizations who are building models for good or bad that aren't necessarily accurate, or perhaps they're biased. There's going to be we have to expect bad actors in the industry. And so I think one of the things is standardizing this means we can actually hold them accountable. We can say, we have mandatory fields for explainability. And in order for you to be able to integrate with an EHR, integrate your AI model, you have to be accountable for those information. We also have kind of an expectation that this will make things easier for applications, as this makes developing against it. You're not having NLP in a different place that you're doing kind of rule-based decision making. And yes, talked about the use cases. So as I mentioned, there's an algorithmics on FHIR implementation guide that I'm working on. I apologize, the con of this is there's another implementation guide, but there's kind of something that we needed an ability to do this today. Some of what Sam's about to talk about is very forward thinking, and I was just talking to Viet, if he's here, where we actually need an answer for this right now, because otherwise we're going to have a publicity stunt that someone had a bad experience with FHIR because there wasn't explainability data, or because it wasn't obvious that this was an inference. And so I took a little bit of the separation of data. Sam's going to talk a little bit about what we can do going forward.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about that responsibility. I think the first thing we need to do is figure out how we're going to make sure that those resources are known to be from an inferred source. And there's really two sort of ways that we think about this. Provenance is obviously a good answer for knowing how the resource was built, but we really kind of think that many people are not going to be pulling provenance records. So we actually think that we probably also need to leverage the meta tag. And I'll talk a little bit more when we get to the end about exactly how we could do that. Everything I'm going to talk about is in a white paper that we have published, and there's a link at the end of this to that, so feel free to check it out as I go kind of quickly. But I think that they're really to leverage AI, and I mean AI in general, including NLP, we're going to need some new resources to do that effectively, and new bundle types. Why? Well, I think that there are a number of different kinds of AI, NLP, all out there, right? They do amazingly different things in amazingly different ways, but in general, what they're doing in the end is identifying entities with attributes on them, right? So even a sentiment analysis is saying, hey, this section of text has this attribute on it. And what we want to do is we want to make that data universally useful. So most AI systems today are kind of purpose-built, right? They have output which goes into a specific purpose and is interpreted by a specific system downstream. If we can leverage standards in FHIR, we can make that data universally available to any of the many FHIR solutions that are out there, as long as we do that responsibly, right? So how do we do that? Well, I'm suggesting that we would have a new resource type called inferred entity, right? And then a new resource type called inferred relationship. And the two of those together would let us express a lot of the output of AI in a very standard format. One of the most important parts, I think, is standardizing the entity types. As I look across many different AI systems, everybody chooses their own list of descriptors for what kind of entities. You know, some people are going to call it a procedure, some people are going to call it a condition, some people are going to call it whatever, you know. If we can get people to standardize on a list, then we have a huge benefit in the ability to make that data interpretable downstream, right? And FHIR already has most of that in its resource types. Right? I think that we need to expand that list just a little bit, but it's mostly there. So if we have that, then we really can go from an inferred entity that saw thyroid disease, right, with a confidence, to a condition resource with a SNOMED code. And the only thing that we need to do is do that meta tag to make sure that we continue to carry over that confidence and the understanding that it's inferred. So hope you got something out of this today. The main thing is that these are a place to start the conversation. We really want to talk with everybody. We know that there are flaws in what we're proposing. Please come up and reach out to us, and we want to put a community together. And we're going to go to Q&A in just a second, but I just want to say a couple of words about why this is important to me, right? I think there's some really, really interesting things that are happening in our world today. One of them is this statistic that in 2034, there'll be this age switch where more people will be over 65 than under 18 in the US. This is already true in Japan. It's going to be true in many parts of Europe, too. And at the same time, we're facing a real shortage of medical professionals, right? And we may be able to correct that over 7-8 years, but it's going to take some time to correct that. And who's that going to fall on? That's going to fall on us, right? We're going to have to be responsible for our parents, who are going to be remote many places, because as we all know, we generally don't live with our parents anymore, right? It's also going to fall on administrative staff as health plans learn that they have to be partners with their members in order to mitigate costs down the road. And those two constituents are not going to be medical professionals. They need AI to be implemented responsibly in order to understand that data and make it really actionable for them. And so that's why I'm personally passionate about it and why I think you guys should be passionate about it too.
Awesome. I think, yeah, so if you want to find us, you can find us here. Or we have our emails up there as well. And I think we have some time for Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you both. So yesterday during the pub talk, is it getting too complicated? We were trying to sunset resources, but here we have two new candidates. Any questions from the room? Fiat, go ahead, please.
So I was struck by your Zulip screenshot, and I've had a similar thing there. So the question is, I'll start with a statement. I agree that I think this activities around AI and machine learning are really important. So the question is, what do you think would be the best way to build that community so that we not only have the community of implementers who need to develop the technology, but the community of the standards folks to do it? Are you planning to do this work within the CDS work group, or is it a community practice? I'm hesitant to say, is this an accelerator? I don't think it's quite an accelerator yet, but I think we need to have that community in a place where you're having the conversations you need that represents these ideas so you can do the knowledge share.
Totally, and I'm glad our new implementation, HL7 leadership, just asked that question, because it is definitely something, there's a lot of working groups that are thinking of surrounding ideas, so even quality metrics deals with this and statistics. Would be open for proposals. Sam, I don't know if you have an idea, but I think it's a great opportunity for the new implementation division to look into what's the best way to engage the community.
Okay, so if you're not on Zulip, get on Zulip, sign up for the stream for ML Analytics. It's a stream within Zulip, and we'll try to figure that out and communicate to you there. Thanks.
From the room, and then we'll have a question from the online audience.
Of course, once Viet, gets up and talks, I got to follow him right away. So one of my suggestions would be to leverage the new statement of understanding between AMIA and HL7, so the American Medical Informatics Association, and HL7 for that exact purpose. So this is actually pretty new. It was signed in February. Chuck and I, we worked for a year and a half to get this done. Now it's done, and so now the question is, so what are we going to do that's value added? American Medical Informatics Association is very active in AI and ML. Lots of my colleagues do that. I do that. They have competitions for AI kind of challenges and so on. And so I think that's where kind of a lot of the ferment is that would feed into kind of your standardization efforts. So Chuck, actually Viet and I, we can take that back to our next steering committee meeting for this. But I think there's a great chance to have two organizations synergize that haven't really synergized as much as they should have in the last couple of years.
Definitely. I think that's what we've learned is people are thinking about it. There's a ton of organizations and even communities within FHIR who have thought about this, but we haven't had a cohesive way of going about it, and we haven't had a single kind of place for us to get together and really build out the best practices. And so if nothing else, this is an opportunity for us to do that.
Okay, let's have a question here, and you may want to revisit this session on Hoover because there's a few questions we will not be able to answer all of them. A suggestion for even more new resources. There's a risk for the FHIR resources enriched with the meta tags. They will get more and more complex. So wouldn't it make more sense to create new FHIR resources that focus on the AI-derived fields, such as confidence, model generation, source data tracking, etc.?
Yeah.
What is your comment?
I think that that we need to get better at understanding what that inferred entity resource really needs to be. My thinking of the meta tag is really that one of the elements of it needs to point to wherever that evidence or inferred entity is for that more detailed information. We got to be really careful that we don't overload the meta tag with too much. I want it to, we need it to be just enough to give the person an understanding, and then the tool can go and find out a lot more from looking at other resources. Now, the inferred entity may only be one of those resources that we need. And so I definitely want to talk to people about what's in there. As you saw in our white paper, we have a spec for it, but it certainly could be better.
And I actually don't know if we need to, before we even get to new resources, there's a lot of things we can reuse within existing resources. So for example, evidence in R4B has the ability to add p-value. That's extremely helpful. And so there's a lot that we can use and be done before we even introduce new resources. And I think we have to, because of US Core being in R4, we need the ability to represent this in R4 as well. Hey, Josh.
Hey, really important topic, and I was just walking up to the microphone to say exactly what you just said, which is, yeah, let's make sure this works in R4 and all the regulated systems that people are investing their time and energy in building, and then we can sort of learn from the pain points there to take it forward.
All right, we had Josh's support, so it's final.
Thank you, Josh. Anyone? Otherwise, I have a question here. Maybe I didn't understand the proposal, but wouldn't an element on each resource make more sense than an entirely new resource? For instance, a source element with confidence. Is there a downside to this?
So I think that's the meta tag, and I'll let you address
Is that the meta tag? Okay.
But I will say, not everyone necessarily looks at other parts of resource. You can imagine if you just pull up conditions, grandma isn't always going to look at where that condition came from in a subset of that. So there is some need for complete separation of the two, but I'll let you address that.
I mean, I think it's an interesting point. As I say, you know, we want to keep what we do to the meta tag not to expand to just try to include everything, because that's the mistake that's been made in the past in medical standards, right? Is trying to expand it to include everything. And the beauty of FHIR is that it links these things or otherwise. I think inferred entity, to me, is really a representation of, a standardized representation of what comes out of an AI system. And the people who produce those standards don't want to worry about what is a FHIR condition. What are all the pieces that I need to fill in a FHIR condition? They don't do that today. What they do today is build a custom format that produces basically what's in the inferred entity. I've looked at a bunch of them out there and sort of tried to pull them together. And I don't want to force them to learn FHIR. I want them to just be able to learn this. And then us FHIR experts be able to translate that into appropriate FHIR resources. So that's why I sort of suggested the difference between inferred entity and...
Yeah, I just would point out, I guess, that so many of the FHIR resources we have are inferred. They come from human inferences, and there's we're just taking that and, you know, extending it to machines, and I don't want to discriminate between a human inference and a machine inference. They both have sources, they both have data, they both have, you know, their algorithm or their, you know, evidentiary support. So I don't see the compelling case for a inferred, you know, evidence, you know.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the nasty little secret that we don't like to admit ever is that all data in medicine is probabilistic. There's always a non-zero chance that the doctor wrote it down wrong, that it got transcribed wrong, you know, whatever. And so there's a level of me that would love us to just start expressing that across the system. But that's not going to happen, because we do need our, you know, for our own psychology, we need our medical professionals to be infallible, at least quote infallible.
And I think I think there is a need to separate machine-generated data from human-generated data, because human-generated data today is often viewed as the gold standard source of truth. And that gold standard source of truth can serve many use cases. And a physician needs to understand a physician made that inference versus an algorithm. And they want to understand that. And so I do think there is, I talk about machine versus human generated data often, and the need to separate that from a user perspective is really important.
Okay, so a lot of fundamental discussions here, and there's room for one final statement. Gentleman here to the right of me.
Thank you. Jesper Kjær from the Danish Medicines Agency, and also, I mean, as a European citizen with the medical device regulation, the AI regulation, I really salute and appreciate the effort you do here, because we're actually lacking real-world data in the area, and the traceability down to the confidence level is really appreciated. So keep up the good work, whatever shape and form that takes. Is really important for the safety evaluation of how AI, because they're not liable, right, as a physician is, in the decision that it brings forward. So thank you.
What a good
And thank
ending.
you for making that final remark. Thank you very much, everyone. On to the next session.
Thank you very much for coming.